Okay, so I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar on accountability to affected populations. Together with my colleagues from the ADRA networks Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning Technical Learning Lab, we will be spending an hour going through the key principles that ADRA have for accountability and how you can become more accountable to your stakeholders. And before we start, I would like to inform you that we are offering translation into Spanish for those who would prefer Spanish. Please click on the interpretation globe at the beginning, at the bottom of your screen, and select Spanish to listen in Spanish. Okay, so together with Daria and Kerry, I will be presenting to you the ADRA network's views on accountability. I will begin by presenting what are the overall requirements of ADRA when accountability is concerned. And then Daria and Kerry will be presenting on the accountability guidelines more in detail and on the assessment matrix, which ADRA is using to operationalize these guidelines. You can ask questions in the chat at any point, and Fahim and Liliana are monitoring the chat and will be asking your questions to the presenters. So please do submit your questions at any time in the chat function, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And the Spanish translation is offered by Nestor. So next slide, please. Okay, so the ADRA network, through the Monitoring, Evaluation, Accountability and Learning Technical Learning Lab, has for the past 3 years been working on developing principles and guidelines for how we can be accountable to all those we are working with. We have developed a new MEAL policy, guidelines for accountability to affected populations, and several documents and tools that will help us fulfill those requirements. Today, we will be going through some of these and explain what it means for ADRA's programs and projects. Okay, so the ADRA's MEAL policy, which was developed in 2020, governs all of ADRA's projects. It highlights the importance of accountability. Especially focusing on the importance of listening to and understanding the needs of beneficiaries and communities, incorporating their needs in the activities and decision-making processes of the projects. ADRA believes that accountability is important for several reasons. Firstly, to create better relationships with those we are working with. And 2, to share knowledge with them about what we are doing and the consequences of this. For them, knowledge about decisions that will impact them are important, so that it may have the best possible impact. And this requires that, and this policy requires us to be accountable to affected populations, that is the beneficiaries. And this includes sharing information, setting up a mechanism for receiving community feedback and complaints, and to carry out changes to implementation and project design if needed. And the guidelines are operationalizing these requirements further. It also requires us to be accountable to donors and other stakeholders, to share information and lessons learned. Okay. And how we can achieve all of this is better explained in the Accountability to Affected Populations Guidelines and the Accountability to Affected Populations Assessment Matrix, which are the topics for the remainder of this webinar. The guidelines contain the key principles of accountability for ADRA including to whom we are accountable and what are our commitments within the field of accountability. The assessment matrix will help us operationalize the guidelines and learn how we can improve our accountability work. I will now leave it to Daria and Kerry to continue this webinar, and I will remind you all that you can send your questions to the presenters through the chat function at the bottom of the screen.
Great, thank you, Eric, and welcome everybody again. So I'm just going to talk a little bit more about what Eric has touched on. I'll go into it a little bit more in detail. So to begin with the purpose of the guidelines, as Eric mentioned, these were developed by the MEAL TLL as a framework for accountability. And they are based very strongly on the commitments of the Interagency Standing Committee and also the Core Humanitarian Standard Guidelines, which you might be familiar with as HAP, or you might know them as the CHS 9 commitments. And really, we wanted these guidelines to be a core part. We wanted to set a framework for how ADRA operates and for accountability to be a core part of that. So ADRA is a signatory to the CHS Alliance. And as Eric mentioned, the MEAL policy also has accountability as a core component. And then you may also be familiar with the ADRA accreditation and licensing, which also has accountability as one of the core commitments. And really, we want to make sure that we are addressing communities' needs at the core, and that we are working with beneficiaries and providing the best kind of quality programs that we can. And we think accountability is a core part of this. And to say to that as well, donors are increasingly interested in seeing accountability, maybe looking specifically at safeguarding as well, but we're seeing this more and more. So these guidelines can be a help to you if donors are looking for some kind of framework for accountability in your projects and for your organizations. So the guidelines are based on some guiding principles that were developed by ADRA a few years ago. And if we can go through them, Gary, thank you. Maybe if we go through all of them, sorry, there are animations on this slide, but we can just look at all of them. So there are 5 guiding principles here that the accountability guidelines are based on. So the first one is about dignity and justice, inclusiveness and participation for all communities. So this is really the fundamental and the core of what our programs and what our programming should be based on. And then the second one is around zero tolerance to any form of abuse of power, sexual exploitation, fraud or corruption, etc. So you may also be familiar with the new safeguarding policies, in which this guiding principle also comes out very strongly, and the accountability framework and the new safeguarding policies and framework go hand in hand as well. Number 3 is around taking complaints seriously. Number 4 is linked to that, sorry, and having effective procedures for responding to complaints and making sure that communities can tell us if they feel that they are in any way being mistreated or have feedback on our work. And number 5 is around taking local context and cultural practices into consideration when developing any kind of accountability or feedback mechanism. So as Eric briefly touched on already, so in the accountability guidelines, we set out 3 main groups of people to whom we're accountable. So the first are communities, beneficiaries in their communities. So looking at how we can really increase communities' power and include them in our programming all the way from design through to implementation, and make sure they can have programs that are owned by them and designed to really address their core needs. Because at the end of the day, we are really there to ensure that communities are developing, and we are facilitators of that. So including them in the design and throughout implementation really is a core part of accountability. And then we have our partners. So these could be CSOs or other local groups that we work with. And we want to make sure, again, that our programs are locally owned, that there is equitable partnership, so that partners feel that they can approach us, talk to us, that we can be consultative as well, that we channel our funding to them transparently, and also to help any partners who maybe don't have as much of a presence or as big visibility in their networks, to help facilitate their inclusion in forums or in any kind of networks that may help them do their programming and be more effective. And then finally, we have also named donors as a group we're accountable to. So this we see through transparent and timely reporting, so making sure that our reports are on time and that we are reporting our activities in a transparent manner. And then we believe that this is not only a compliance issue, but that through being accountable to our donors, we can really foster stronger relationships with them. And together we can create stronger programs that benefit our beneficiaries and their communities in the most effective ways possible. Thanks. So looking at the accountability guidelines, we have based them on the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines as well. So we have these 4 commitments, so 4 key areas which we've structured them by. So the first is leadership, then we have participation and partnership, information, feedback and action, and then results, so learning and improvement. So I'll talk a little bit about each of these commitments in detail now. So for leadership, we have, sorry, Carrie, can we go through the next bullet point? Thank you. So we have a few bullet points here as well. So on leadership, we've tried to give indicators of how we see accountability manifesting or appearing under leadership. So we did a mapping of the CHS and IASC frameworks. We tried to see where they were similar and what we could pull out of them. And that's what these different indicators are based on. They also translate into the assessment matrix, which Kerry will talk a little bit about later. But the first one is about accountability minimum standards being included in the country office's strategic plans. So not just at project level, but really trying to make this an organizational commitment to be accountable and to have some level of accountability reflected in those strategic documents. The second one is about every proposal having a section on how the country office will implement the ADRA accountability standards. So rather than saying we have a policy, it would be great to also say we have a policy and this is how we are implementing it, and include that in project proposals when submitting them to donors. The third one is around making sure that staff are aware and trained on these guidelines and also the code of conduct. So making sure that staff know what expectations are when it comes to accountability and how they can ensure that they behave in accountable ways through their work. And then linked to that is accountability being integrated into staff job descriptions. And then again, when we're working with partners, making sure that our partnership agreements and MOUs have a section describing how partners will also implement the ADRA accountability standards. So this commitment is more around inclusion of partners and making sure that they have a say in the programming, and going back to what I said earlier about programs being locally owned. So the first one here is about communities participating in targeting and beneficiary selection criteria. So making sure that it's not a top-down approach, and also making sure that community capacities are identified in assessments and in the planning of projects. So understanding how communities will contribute to the project with their own inputs, their skills, their labor. So making sure that those projects really are benefiting the communities. And then, as I mentioned as well, ensuring that partners and CBOs are strengthened to help improve community participation. Okay, oh, I thought there was one more, sorry. And then the third commitment is about information, feedback, and action. So this links mostly to community feedback mechanisms. In the guidelines themselves, you'll see this commitment is very long, and we've taken out just a summary here. There's more to it, but we will be holding a webinar on community feedback and complaints mechanisms a little bit later on. So we will come back and talk about this in more detail then. But just to summarize, so really this is about being transparent with communities, making sure they know who ADRA is, what ADRA's mission is, what the goals and objectives and timelines of the projects that they are involved in are, that they know how beneficiary selection works, that they know what the targeting criteria are, and then also what they can expect from ADRA staff. So what the code of conduct is, for example, what are the commitments made for prevention of sexual exploitation and abuse? So making sure that communities are aware of all this information. And also that they know that they have a right to provide feedback and complaints, and that these feedback and complaints will be resolved and handled confidentially and professionally. And then making sure that the complaints mechanisms are also available in local languages, and that they are inclusive, and that all members of the community can access them no matter what the barriers may be. And then finally, looking at how we can capture that feedback and making sure that we capture that feedback and then use it to improve the interventions that we have. And then the last commitment is about learning. So making sure that we use what we have, the information that we gain, to improve our programs. So this is looking at consulting communities, getting informal feedback in that way. It doesn't always have to be through suggestion boxes or desks, but having those conversations with communities to make sure that our programs are on track and they're still meeting the needs of the community as what the needs assessment showed. And then also that we feed back to the community about the outcomes of consultations. So that they know how we're using their feedback to improve programs and to change maybe the implementation that we're doing. And then finally, looking at how the accountability framework and the guidelines can be monitored through our own internal self-assessments. So this is what Kerry is going to talk a little bit about, how the matrix will help with us doing our own learning and improving our accountability processes. Thank you. Over to you, Kerry.
Thank you, Daria, and thank you, Eric. Now we'll move into the assessment matrix portion. So what is the purpose of the assessment matrix? Well, now that we've gone through the guidelines, how do we know that our office and our programs are truly being accountable? We've developed an assessment matrix as a practical tool to help operationalize the accountability guidelines. And this is a learning tool to help improve accountability here at ADRA. Using the assessment matrix is strongly recommended, but it is not mandatory, and it's not an accredited assessment, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Also, this assessment is more of a light touch learning review rather than a large donor style accountability audit. We don't want you to feel burdened by this. Rather, it should be more of a learning review process that will help your office and your programs. And this can be done at a programmatic level or an organizational level. And this will be up to your office, how large it is and how many programs you have. So this is just a little screenshot of what the assessment matrix looks like. You can see that there are 4 levels for all 4 commitments. Not compliant, which is level 1, basic, maturing, IASC CHS compliant, and a commitment is achieved by reaching a score of 3 or 4. And for IASC CHS compliance, all 4 commitments require a score of 4. And in a specific project, this should be achieved for all implementing and supporting offices. There's also a column for means of verification. And in this column, it lists the different documents and sources recommended to help verify what level each commitment is at. And again, this is for all 4 commitments. This is just a snapshot of what the assessment matrix looks like. We also have a standard operating procedure for the assessment matrix. So this includes the process for the accountability assessment, a checklist for the specific task and responsible persons, and a frequently asked questions section, which we'll go over. But the process involves, like the overview of the process involves assembling a team, conducting a desk review of relevant documents, using the matrix to assess where you are on the scale, preparing a short summary of the findings, and conducting a short workshop on findings and preparing an action plan, which we have a template for, and holding quarterly review meetings to assess the progress. And we recommend for this assessment to be completed annually. And again, this is a process that shouldn't take too much of your time, and it's not as rigorous as donor accountability audits. This is more of a learning review. And this is just a snapshot of the SOP. Please note that this is a draft SOP, and it may be updated in the next few months. But we'll be sure to upload the latest version on ENET. And if you need access to ENET, ask one of your colleagues who may have access to ENET, or you can email myself and I can help facilitate getting you access to ENET. So now we're going to go over a few frequently asked questions that are on the SOP. So we're just going to put the questions up here and I'll be answering them. However, they are on the SOP document on ENET. So if you miss any of the answers, you can go back to reference it. And again, if you have any questions throughout this presentation, please put it in the chat and we'll answer it after this. So the first question that's on it is, who is responsible for coordinating the assessment? Now, this will depend on how the office is organized. However, in most cases, it is expected that the MEAL manager will lead the assessment, but with input from ADCOM, MEAL officers, and the safeguarding focal point or the safeguarding officer. What does the assessment process involve? Please read through the SOP that I just mentioned. It has a checklist, it has the process, and you'll be able to do the assessment that way. How long does the assessment process take? The process should not take more than a month. We would suggest that any documentation only need to be revised rather than created from scratch. So it shouldn't take too long. Now, how rigorous does the assessment need to be? Again, this is not a mandatory assessment, but ADRA strongly emphasizes accountable programming, and the assessment is a valuable learning tool in this regard. The more you engage with the process, the greater the benefits of your office and the network. Is this assessment to be conducted on an organizational or programmatic level? Again, this will really depend on your office. Ideally, this assessment should be conducted on an organizational level, but we understand that this might be complex for offices who have multiple projects or very large projects. Do we have to share this with ADRA International? It would be good to share the assessment with donor and partners, as this will contribute to the network-wide effort to improve accountability. If ADRA International is your donor office, please do share this with your MEAL advisor. Is this an accredited assessment? Not at the moment. However, please see criterion 5 of the AAL that Daria mentioned. We strongly encourage all offices to use this to verify OVI 5.1.1 and 5.1.2. And our last question on the FAQs. Does this assessment comply with donor accountability requirements? So the assessment and accountability guidelines are based on IASC and CHS principles, which are widely recognized as a standard in our industry. However, donors do often have varying requirements, so please check with your donor about their guidelines and expectations. So hopefully that answered some of your questions that you may have. And now we will go into the Q&A session. So Daria, myself, and Eric are here to answer any questions that you have put in the chat. Let's see, Fahim or Liliana, are there any questions from the chat that we need to answer?
No, not at this point, not yet.
Okay. So if anyone has any questions, please go ahead and put it in the chat right now. If not, you can come off of mute and ask it. But go ahead and put it in the chat if you do. And I will go off mute for a second. And again, this is being recorded. We'll be sending out the PowerPoints, the PowerPoint slides, the recordings, all of the resources that you've just seen, so the guidelines, the matrix, what else? The action plan template, and the SOP. That is all on ENET. If you need access to ENET, please let me know. I will put my email in the chat, and I will help facilitate that. Or some of your colleagues may have access to ENET already. So you can ask them for some help. I'm not seeing any questions. Fahim, was there any other? Were there any questions that came in?
No, there wasn't.
No questions. Okay. Yeah. So if we don't have any other questions, we will conclude this webinar. And again, the recording will be sent out, the PowerPoints. We have translated the resources, so the guidelines, the matrix, the SOP. We have translated those into Spanish and in French, so that you can have that. We apologize that we couldn't have French translation this time. We'll be working on that for the next webinar. And as Daria mentioned, we will be having a webinar on community feedback and response mechanisms. So feedback and complaint mechanisms, you may know it as, hopefully at the end of November or early December. So be looking out for that. And if you have not already joined the MEAL COP Community of Practice, please do so on HumHub. You can also email me for access if you're not able to join. Please go ahead and email me. But if you're already on HumHub, please join the MEAL COP. We'd love to have you, and we will be updating that regularly with any resources, webinars, things like that. And you can engage with the MEAL TLL as well there. Daria or Eric, do you have any last words for us here? None?
No, just want to say thank you to everybody for joining. And as Kerry said, if you have any questions once you've had time to review these guidelines and the matrix, please feel free to get in touch.
Yes, thank you so much. Yes, thank you to Daria, to Eric for helping present, and thank you so much to Nestor for interpreting into Spanish simultaneously. Hopefully that was helpful for our Spanish colleagues, Spanish-speaking colleagues. So with that, we'll conclude our webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. And please be looking out for the email that we'll be sending out later. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.